People who beforehand were maybe only a citizen of the United States may now actually be a dual citizen without even knowing it.
There's times when we were doing spousal sponsorships, work permits, study permits. These people may have spent all this money doing this, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I don't know if it's important, but I have a great grandmother who was Canadian. And you're like, hold on, you cannot be applying for PR because you are a Canadian citizen.
There isn't a stopgap. There isn't really guidance at this point.
We're living in a real life science experiment. If one of your parents were born in Canada, you might already be a Canadian citizen, and most people have no idea.
And if you think the window's closed because it skipped a generation, it might not be. There are paths most people never look into.
Today, we're breaking down the citizenship amendments that affect citizenship by descent, scenarios where you may or may not be a Canadian citizen. We're looking beyond the legislation and the unintended consequences.
I'm Valerie Kleinman.
And I'm Sonia Sidhu. We're immigration lawyers here at Green Spiegel, Canada's largest immigration law firm, and this is Border Banter. So before we scare people, what is Bill C-3 in one sentence, and how would you tell your non-lawyer friend?
So Bill C-3, it was a bill that eventually became enacted. And that means that our Citizenship Act was amended. So now we would really just be talking about the amendments to the Citizenship Act that are now in force. And to summarize it really quickly, it's really all about ancestry. So Canadian ancestry, connections to Canada.
And how that leads to citizenship?
Yes, and how having that Canadian ancestry would lead someone to themselves being a citizen. Not applying for citizenship, but actually being a citizen already.
So was this a proactive update? Like, was it a planned glow up for immigration law, or was it a reaction to something that had gone wrong?
So definitely a reaction. There were a group of litigants that contested the old citizenship legislation. Most recently, before the changes, citizenship by descent was limited to the first generation born outside of Canada. So we had a variety of different laws over the course of history, and really from 2009 until late 2025, if you were a Canadian citizen and you had a child outside of Canada, that child would be a Canadian citizen as well. But if that child eventually had their own child, so your grandchild, that grandchild would not be a Canadian citizen. And people felt that the law was unfair for a variety of reasons, and they brought the government to court, and they won. And because they won, the government was forced to change the law. And it was a long 2-year process to change the law.
So this was a little bit about fairness and legal pressure, you would say?
Definitely legal pressure, because the government had a judgment which invalidated the old law, and so they were forced to change it. So they really didn't have a choice.
So what's the biggest misconception people have about these citizenship laws and Bill C-3?
So one of the misconceptions is that the changes give people access to apply for citizenship. And in fact, the changes make people citizens. So people who, beforehand were maybe only a citizen of the United States may now actually be a dual citizen without even knowing it. So their ancestry and the changes have resulted in a situation where they're potentially actually a citizen without even knowing it.
So if they're already a citizen, what do they need to do? Is there even a process?
Yeah, so because they're not applying for citizenship, they still need to be able to exercise their rights as a citizen, to get a passport, to get a social insurance number if they want to work in Canada, to be able to move to Canada. So in order to do those things, they need to apply to the government for a certificate that will prove that they are a citizen. And with that, they can then do those things, apply for a passport, move to Canada.
Okay, so could someone make this application at the border? Would they just show up with proof that their ancestry is Canadian?
Unfortunately, they can't. As you can probably imagine, this can be a complicated application, especially when we're dealing with somebody whose ancestor may have been born a very long time ago. So this is an application where many supporting documents have to be gathered, detailed forms have to be completed, and the application actually has to be mailed to the Government of Canada, where they will review the application and then make a decision.
And how long are these decisions taking?
So this is something that's evolving. The law changed in December, and it's really opened up, the number of people who the eligibility to submit this application. So before we had people in the first generation born abroad who were applying, and now we have all these additional people who are able to apply. So we are seeing increases in the processing time, and actually now it's increased to 12 months. That being said, there are scenarios where people can't wait 12 months. So maybe, you can think of somebody who's been accepted to university in Canada, maybe to the University of Toronto, and they need to reply to the University of Toronto to let them know if they're going to be attending. Well, they have to figure out, are they a Canadian citizen or are they a foreigner who's going to need a study permit? And with that, are they paying domestic tuition fees as a citizen, or are they paying international fees as a foreign student? So there's all kinds of, complicated situations where people can't wait a year, where the school needs to know if they're a citizen or not, and they need to know if they're a citizen or not. Because if it's confirmed, if the certificate is issued and yes, they are a citizen, they can't apply for a study permit normally as a citizen. So there are scenarios where expedited processing can be requested. There are, fairly narrow scenarios in which this would be considered by the government, and there really has to be a very pressing need for the person to be in Canada for them to consider processing it faster.
Yeah, and just in like real life, like on paper, this all sounds amazing, but it gets very complicated and convoluted. We have people here with work permits, right? And they're coming up for a work permit expiry. Do you submit the work permit extension? Do you not? Because technically, like you said, they're Canadian citizens, so they shouldn't be getting a work permit. And has the government even released any sort of stopgaps to address these issues?
So there haven't been. There haven't been stopgaps, and it's left people in a situation where they don't really know what to do. And it is a huge issue, and it's not. I think maybe when hearing about it, somebody might think, oh well, this probably doesn't affect that many people, but I think it actually affects many people. As people are discovering the effects of the new legislation, they are then realizing, wow, I might actually be a Canadian citizen, but here I am on a work permit. What do I do? My work permit's expiring. So we are seeing these scenarios come up quite frequently. And there isn't a stopgap. There isn't really guidance at this point on a specific process for these people, or a stopgap for these people.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that you said, when this amendment came out, or even when Bill C-3 was coming and the court cases was happening, it seemed pretty clear. But then as life happens, as scenarios come up, there's scenarios that are still coming up that, we didn't even think about, or, we're practicing this a day in and day out. And we're like, oh, hold on, we never thought about this, or what would happen here. And we, as the lawyers here, we will huddle together and say, okay, what was the law then? How did it transition to this? And trying to figure out, is there a claim to Canadian citizenship, right? Beyond that, you had mentioned processing times about 12 months, but I think another important thing we should bring up is you need documentary evidence of this lineage. And what we're noticing in practice, and correct me if I'm wrong, Valerie, is a lot of these entities that have these vital statistics and records are inundated by these requests, and you're seeing a major delay where documents were received in a couple of days or weeks now are taking months.
Right. Well, imagine this. You have provincial offices that normally would store things like birth certificates and archival records that probably typically had a certain level of activity and a certain number of requests, and then all of a sudden all these people need access to these documents. So it's been covered in the media. There's a lot of demand, and there are backlogs with many provincial offices that are trying to keep up with the surge in requests for their ancestors' birth records. And there's also all kinds of complications with that when we're especially dealing with people who were born a long time ago, and were their birth records, was their birth registered? um, we know that in certain places, government didn't register have a registry of birth. So there are all kinds of complex scenarios, particularly the further back that we go when looking at a Canadian ancestor.
Yeah, I think it gets really exciting. Like I had a situation where a house was on the border. So one side of the house fell in the US
Wow.
and the other side fell into Canada. So it's like, what side was the birth given on?
Wow.
And that was determining the ancestry,
Wow.
which is crazy because you wouldn't think anything like this, right? To us, borders are very clear now. We are born on one side of the border or another. There's no houses on both sides, right? So it actually gets really exciting. It gets very fun to try to sort these situations out. And I think, I mean, I did have a question saying, like, is this a fix all everything? Or, is there a patch? We patched one hole and there's still leaks in other parts. But I think we've kind of started touching on that it didn't fix everything.
That's right.
And we're still leaking on certain parts of this legislation. But can you go into a little bit more like, hey, where are we seeing these issues arising where, the legislation may not have taken into account certain situations and now we might see ourselves having to amend again?
Right. So, certainly the scenarios we've discussed where there are people who are already in Canada or have an immediate need to come to Canada. There's also all kinds of consequences for people who even want to come visit Canada, because if you're a citizen of France, but you're also a citizen of Canada, you're a dual citizen, you actually need a Canadian passport to board an airplane just to come on vacation. So there's all kinds of, complicated scenarios. But one of the, you're mentioning, is it a leak, or, sort of for some populations, it's not just a leak. It's more like a huge pour, because particularly for people who are adoptees, the legislation didn't correct some of the previous concerns with respect to how adopted children are treated compared to non-adopted children. So, the scenario we've really been talking about so far has been the ancestors, born in Canada. We also have other scenarios where the ancestor naturalized, so became a Canadian citizen before the birth of their child, so that they can pass it on. But we also have, very many situations where people are adopted. And under both the previous and current legislation, when somebody is adopted by a Canadian citizen, they are not automatically a Canadian themselves. So they actually need to apply to become a citizen. They need to apply for a grant of citizenship. There is a streamlined process for adopted people where they don't go through some of the same requirements that somebody who's maybe a permanent resident in Canada who is trying to naturalize would have to go through, like writing a citizenship test and spending a certain amount of time in Canada. So they have a more direct access to naturalization, but they've
So I'm going to interrupt you there. You said grant of citizenship. How's that different than everything we've been talking about?
Yeah, so we're talking about so far people who are citizens and they're applying for a citizenship certificate to prove that they're a citizen. A grant is an actual request to be granted, to be given citizenship. So,
Yeah, so the date on that citizenship certificate would be the date that they were granted it, which would be present time.
yep,
And then the proof certificate would be from the date they were born,
that's
correct?
right.
Yeah.
Because there are certain provisions in the act that are retroactive. So, somebody who today is eligible for a citizenship certificate that wouldn't have been 5 years ago, when they apply for their certificate, when it's issued, their date of citizenship is going to be their date of birth. When we're dealing with someone who is adopted, they are not applying for proof that they already are a citizen. They're actually applying to become citizens. So when they get their certificate, it will have the date when that is approved. So when they become a citizen. So, it could be a future date if they're starting this process now. And that's where we see sort of one of the sort of pores or floods, in terms of this, because we have scenarios where somebody maybe wouldn't have been able to do this before. They're maybe second generation. So they were adopted by a first generation Canadian born abroad. They're the second generation, and they're now applying for citizenship, a grant, and they're going to get their citizenship at a future date. So maybe, and it's a long process as well. It's a two-stage process, and it is a long process. So let's say it takes another 2 years. So in 2028, they become a citizen. If they have children who were born before 2028, those kids are not going to be citizens because that parent was not a citizen at the time of their birth. Or if they're adopting, similarly, they were not a citizen at the time of their adoption. So we have scenarios where people couldn't do this before because they were limited by the first generational limit. Now they can proceed, they can apply for a grant of citizenship, but their kids are not going to be citizens. And then there may be other options, if they're planning to move to Canada and their kids are young enough, maybe they can sponsor them for permanent residence and then eventually they'll become citizens, but maybe
Yeah.
not. Or maybe their kid is 23 and can't be sponsored for permanent residence. So, we can really, what we see is we see families where kids in the same family are treated differently. And I'm seeing it. So I'm seeing it, I have one child who's adopted, one child who's my biological child. I adopted a child 2 years ago, gave birth to a child 4 years ago, all before the legislation passed. And the child that's the biological child is a citizen, and the adopted child is not and has to apply to become a citizen.
With one caveat, right? If they're potential biological parents for Canadian.
Yes, and that's a really good point. And we are seeing scenarios where people are aware of their biological lineage and are gathering that information to be able to show that they actually are a citizen by descent, despite having been adopted by a Canadian. That's a very interesting thing.
Further, say my father was adopted by Canadians. Okay. My father did not apply for Canadian citizenship. I am the biological child of my father. This law comes out now, but my father is deceased.
Yeah, so that's another big difference because they're deceased. They never became a citizen. They weren't a citizen at the time when you were born. With the biological, if that was sort of the same scenario, but you were their biological child, it actually wouldn't matter that they were deceased. There's provisions in the act that allow the citizenship to continue to be passed down, despite the fact that they were deceased. So that's another issue. The other thing too, in terms of families, same family but maybe various scenarios, something we haven't really touched on yet is we've really been focusing on people who were born before the amendments were passed. So before this was in force, December 15th, 2025. But anyone born after that date has an additional burden. So they're not just showing that their ancestor was born in Canada and there's a direct ancestral link between each generation, but they actually also have to show that their Canadian parent had a substantial connection to Canada before they were born, which the law is defining as having spent 1,095 days in Canada in their lifetime before the birth of that child who is now applying.
Which comes to another crazy point. Say I'm 40 and I did spend, maybe 3 years in Canada when I was a toddler. What proof am I going to get?
Yeah, I think this is going to be really interesting to see this evolve. This is really new because it's going to be for anyone who was born very recently. We can imagine situations where it won't be that difficult, maybe, where somebody maybe went to university in Canada or worked in Canada. Maybe they have tax documents, things like that. But certainly, your scenario with a toddler, they're not going to have school records. It will be very tricky, and it will be interesting to see what comes of that, and if there's litigation around that. And the other way that we see that affecting people is how it can unevenly treat siblings again. So we have the adoption issue, but we also might have a family where they have two kids, one kid born in 2024, and another one was just born in March 2026. So the 2024 kid might be a citizen by descent, but the 2026 kid can't just look at the ancestry. We also have to look at whether the parents spent that time in Canada, which in many cases they probably didn't. So we will see siblings with completely different rights because of the way that the amendments were structured.
And that's really mind blowing, right? Like you're born, say, even 9 months apart, and that could really change the trajectory of if you are a Canadian citizen or not, and if you can even pass it down later. Which, I mean, I'm not in this situation, but there are people in this situation, and it's really hard to wrap your head around how, the rights can be so different within even 9 months of a child, right? Like, for example, like we have people who came here for summer camp when they were younger. So they do make the days, but they have no way of getting those documents. Um, Summer camps did not keep records in the 1980s that would still exist. So summer camps may not still exist, right? So we as lawyers really have to get creative of how we can present this evidence, what we can do, and this is where it gets to me it gets very fun here, right? It's not your mundane application. It's hey, let's get us thinking outside the box. Let's put these things together, see what we can do, and present it to the government. And we're yet to see how the government is going to take everything because this is so new. We don't know if they're going to take a very hard stance on it has to be official documents or, what are the agency considerations to documents. It's really, we're living in a real life science experiment for immigration law with citizenship, which actually I love because it is what keeps us going and having to use our brains and intellectually think about past laws, countries, other countries, there's a connection with Quebec and France, there's a connect with Ireland and the UK, and then Canada, and then migration down towards the US. So it becomes really exciting. So there's situations where, there's a group of Mennonites that were passing through Canada, and they have descendants that could have been born in Canada during that passage. Now they have a lineage up to Canada. It's exciting. New categories, like, new pathways have opened up to people. And sometimes what we were doing for someone previously has completely changed course, right? There's times when we were doing spousal sponsorships. We were doing work permits. We were doing study permits. And, these people may have spent all this money doing this. And then all of a sudden they're like ready to land and say, oh, I don't know if it's important, but I have a great grandmother who was Canadian. Does that matter? And you're like, hold on, you cannot be applying for PR because you are a Canadian citizen. Now we have to go back to the government and wait for them to rectify all this. And what they may have been ready to start life as a PR in Canada, and now everything's delayed.
We are seeing, and this isn't, a unique situation. We are seeing many situations like this, which is really interesting. And one of the nice things about doing this work is also seeing how happy people are about the news. And, I've spoken to people who have always felt like they've had a strong connection to Canada, to their heritage. And, they talk about how much it means to them. And for, other people, they want to be able to, enjoy certain opportunities in Canada. And so it really is changing people's lives.
Yeah, there's so much going on. Like there's estate planning that changes because now all of a sudden you're a Canadian citizen. How does your estate succession change? Right? Mind you, we're immigration lawyers. We don't know anything about that, but we've seen it come up in situations. So it really is trickling into numerous facets of everybody's lives, right? And things that they weren't aware of and things that might totally change the course they were on. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What about dual citizenship or citizenship to 3 countries?
Yeah. So
how does that play in?
Yeah. So for Canada's purposes, we recognize we don't have any issue with multiple citizenship. So you can have there's no restriction on how many, passports you can hold. But there are other countries where there are restrictions. There are countries where you can only have one citizenship. So one of the things with this law is that, again, it's not for, people with a biological connection. It's not just creating an avenue to apply. It is actually making people Canadian citizens. And so for somebody that lives in a country where dual citizenship is not recognized, all of a sudden they actually are dual citizens. And so with the legislation, they also introduced a kind of an express renunciation process for people who do not want to be Canadian citizens anymore. And it's supposed to be a faster process for people who have become citizens through this legislation. So it is complicated. It is complicated for many people who may live. There are many countries that don't accept dual citizenship.
And it'll be interesting to see how countries pick up on this and how they change their legislation to come in line with this, because they may have citizens that are now dual citizens, but they don't allow it.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how countries are dealing with it, even if countries are aware of it. For example, like I can tell you, like my grandfather didn't want to get Canadian citizenship because India didn't allow dual citizenship, and he didn't want to lose the status of being able to deal with his property and everything in India, or having to go through an extensive process and maybe prolonged. However, I was born here, but say I wasn't, and he decided to settle. My dad was there. I was born in India. I would have lost that chance for a descent of Canadian citizenship because my grandfather at that point made a logical decision.
Mm-hmm.
But it actually backfired in the long run.
Absolutely. There's also another scenario with naturalization that we're getting a lot of questions. So, we'll have people come to us and say, hey, my grandparents are Canadian citizens. They naturalized. And we say, okay, great. Well, when did they naturalize? And when were you born? When was your parent born? Right? Because if the grandparents naturalized after the parent was born, the next generation was born, it ends there. For the person's parent to be a Canadian, they would have had to naturalize before their birth. So just because a grandparent or a parent is a Canadian citizen does not mean that their children or grandchildren are automatically Canadian citizens as well. And especially when we're dealing with people who naturalized and became Canadian citizens, there's a lot to look at in terms of the timing and when it occurred.
Yeah, so on the face of it, it sounds very simple and easy, but when you get into the nitty-gritty and the various laws, it becomes very complicated very quick. And then on top of that, the document collection.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Okay. If this amendment were a person,
yeah,
is it a hero or is it someone cleaning a situation up?
So the answer is largely dependent on the person who is interacting with the legislation. So, certainly, like I said, I speak to many people who are thrilled to find out that they're Canadian citizens. And so for some, it would be a hero. All of a sudden, they potentially have access to another country and all types of opportunities. For others, I'd say particularly people who are adopted, they may feel that the government, was trying to deal with the issue before the courts and did not fully deal with all of the issues from the previous legislation. So they did sort of what they had to do to enact new legislation, but there are still remaining issues with the legislation. And if you look at the Citizenship Act, it's so complicated and so many revisions. So in some ways, it's maybe a bit of patching up some of the holes in the wall instead of redoing the wall and having a nice new wall.
It's a good Band-Aid solution.
Exactly. Yeah. If anything we covered today sounds like your situation, even if you're not sure, that's exactly when you should reach out.
We're more than happy to have a consultation with you and try to determine if you are a Canadian citizen and help guide you through the process.
The link to book is in the description and it only takes seconds. And if you found this helpful, subscribe to us on YouTube, or if you're listening to this episode on an audio platform, then leave a review of our podcast. We're breaking down Canadian immigration every episode.
On behalf of all the amazing lawyers here at Green Spiegel, especially you, Valerie, today, thank you for tuning into this episode of Border Banter, an immigration podcast. Until next time.